It's been 30 years since the first DoD other transaction agreement. Other transactions have had a hard time gaining traction in the DoD. To paraphrase an article that you wrote a few years ago in the National Defense Magazine, why do you think OTs are so poorly understood and little used?
Well, you're right. It's been 30 years. April 2020 will be 30 years since the first OT agreement was executed at DARPA. The original OT authority that was enacted at that time was a DARPA-specific piece of legislation. And at DARPA, OTs were supported by the director of DARPA because the director was interested in and understood the potential of OTs. The staff of DARPA, the technical management staff, the program managers, the people that had a mission to accomplish and money to put on that mission gained an understanding of OTs and their potential. And therefore at DARPA, OTs rapidly became a growth industry. And when OTs were expanded beyond DARPA to the military departments, there were people that embraced them. In the Air Force, there was Major General Claude Bolton, who headed a study of OTs and their potential utility for the Air Force. So during the 1990s, OTs were a growth industry. They were widely used for science and technology projects, including projects with multiple parties and with private sector money being added to the project. At DARPA, we called that the Technology Reinvestment Project. They eventually, by the late 1990s, were being used for major defense acquisition programs like Global Hawk, like Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle. All the services had a major OT acquisition project. The point in time, just about at the turn of the millennium, is when some events started to occur that slowed down the growth of other transactions. One of these was the promulgation of regulations governing 10 U.S.C. 2371, the Science and Technology Authority. Those regulations, called Technology Investment Agreement regulations, were sort of a mini FAR. I mean, we had DARPA executing OTs basically just using the statutory guidance, the statutory requirements of the OTs. And then these regulations were issued by DoD. If you actually read the TIA regulations, the Technology Investment Agreement regulations, they actually apply to only a small slice of 10 U.S.C. 2371 agreements, but many people seem to assume, or they just applied them to all science and technology agreements. And because they were prescriptive in nature, they reduced the flexibility, they made other science and technology, other transactions less attractive. Congress had along the way amended the original OT authority in several ways. It had expanded it to the entire Department of Defense, and it had expanded it into the area of prototype projects directly relevant to weapons and weapon systems. And as I just said, major acquisition programs were executed using these OTs. These major acquisition programs typically involved defense contractors. And in the year 2000, there was an amendment to the prototype OT statute that basically said if you don't have a non-traditional contractor involved, you must have 1/3 cost sharing. Now, the purpose of that amendment, as shown in its legislative history, was actually dual-pronged. One was to encourage more non-traditional contractors to participate, but the second one was to increase the efficiency of defense contractors. Mm-hmm. And that prong of the fork has basically been overlooked. And the idea came that, well, OTs are only for non-traditional contractors, even the prototype projects. Then the final negative aspect that came about was some Senate hearings related to the Army's future combat system. The largest acquisition program in the Army was being executed as an OT, and that program ran into some management problems. And witnesses came in to that hearing and said, well, the problem is the OT agreement. And I've read their testimony in great detail, and I'm convinced they never read the OT agreement between Boeing and the Army for the future combat system. Moreover, the Institute for Defense Analyses later did a study and looking at OT, study on FCS management, not just the agreement, but the agreement as part of the management structure, and concluded that the FCS program actually benefited by being executed as an OT. Because the basic agreement that the Army entered into between Boeing and the Army looked like a procurement contract. It had all of the required clauses that people refer to as protections of the government. I'm dubious that those are protections, but those clauses were in. The value of the agreement was that Boeing could subcontract to innovative companies, to commercial companies that didn't normally do business with the government, and there was no required flow down of those government clauses, and so those companies could remain commercial, innovative companies and still participate in a government program. But those three events led to sort of a negative cast, a negative pall over OTs, and quite frankly, there were senior acquisition officials in the department who were never fans of OTs, and they used the FCS hearings as a way to badmouth or tell tales out of school about OTs, and as I say, darken the pall that had been cast over them in the acquisition community and among contracting officers, and that effect left OTs in a downhill slide for years, and it was not until maybe 7-8 years ago that the downward trend started to tick upward, and it has been ticking upward since then, and I think we're now at obligations of around $7 billion, which, while it's not big, but it's a recovery. So that's sort of the story of the decline. And then the other issue is not well understood. There's a huge deficit in OT education. I mean, at DARPA, we started off with the director of the agency fully embracing OTs, understanding that they were more than just fine-tuning the contracting system. They were a new way of doing business, an alternative to traditional contracting. Program managers embraced the idea of OTs and understood them, and then eventually our contract management office, the original OTs at DARPA were signed by the director, and eventually it was delegated down to contracting officers to become agreements officers, but only after they had become well schooled and participated as a team member in an execution team related to OTs. And that pattern has not been followed by the rest of the Department of Defense. So OT education has never really been emphasized the way it should be, and leadership has not current leadership talks a good game about OTs, but they apparently don't really understand the potential of OTs. If they did, basically all science and technology projects in the department would be executed as OTs, and many major defense programs would also be executed as OTs. So I think that's the answer to your question.
Yes, it is. And if you would like to learn more, please visit our website, strategicinstitute.org.